At 72, I was the forgotten son of the most powerful man in New York. What he didn't know is that every night, I stole a piece of his empire, a secret, a password, a hidden ledger, and delivered it to the one person who hated him as much as I did, the homeless woman he used to call his wife. The table was my father's first and greatest love. 3 inches of solid mahogany, polished to a black mirror that reflected the stern, unforgiving skyline of Manhattan. For 60 years, it had been the altar upon which he'd sacrificed competitors, employees, and family. At 72, I had spent the better part of my life as a silent ornament at its far end. The air in the boardroom was, as always, cold and still, smelling faintly of lemon polish and ozone from the bank of monitors on the far wall. The only sound was the whisper-thin rustle of paper as the other board members, all men 30 years my junior, turned to page 12 of the quarterly report. I knew what was on page 12. A flawed projection model I had flagged weeks ago. My moment came. My father, Marcus Sterling, paused his monologue to take a sip of water. He was 95 years old, a monument of bone and will wrapped in a pinstripe suit, his eyes still possessing the predatory clarity that had terrified Wall Street for half a century. "Father," I began, my voice quiet but clear in the acoustically perfect room. The words felt foreign, a performance I'd long since forgotten how to master. Regarding the Callaway projections on page 12, I believe the model fails to account for the recent instability in the South American logistics chain. A more conservative estimate would be prudent. Silence. 8 pairs of eyes flickered toward me, then immediately to the head of the table. They were waiting for their cue, waiting to see if the old lion would swat the cub. Marcus didn't look at me. He simply set his crystal glass down. The soft click of it meeting the polished wood was as loud as a gunshot. He stared at the report, then lifted his right hand, the one bearing the heavy gold signet ring that had been his father's. With a slow, deliberate motion, he turned the page. Thump. The sound of the page settling was the only answer I would receive. It was his signature move, an act of dismissal so profound it needed no words. He had not just ignored my point. He had erased it. He had erased me. I felt the familiar heat rise in my neck, the decades-old humiliation that tasted like copper. I pressed my fingertips into the cool, unyielding surface of the table, anchoring myself. The leather of my chair creaked as I forced myself to sit perfectly still, to reassemble the placid mask of the useless air. The meeting droned on. I became a ghost, watching the light shift across the city, catching the glint of the Sterling Industries logo etched into the water glasses. My gaze drifted to the oil portrait of my grandfather on the wall. His expression was stern, just like his son's. I wondered if he'd ever felt this profound sense of invisibility. I doubted it. The Sterling men were built to cast shadows, not to live in them. Finally, Marcus closed his binder. The gesture was a signal. The others followed suit, their movements crisp and synchronized. "One final item," he announced, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. "New acquisitions." A predatory gleam entered his eye. This was the part he loved, the hunt. "We are initiating a hostile takeover of the Northgate Medical Foundation." A murmur of approval went through the room. Northgate was a golden goose, ethically run, beloved by the public, and holding several extremely valuable patents. A perfect target for a corporate raider looking to strip it for parts. But the name hit me like a physical blow. Northgate, the room, the table, the city outside the window. It all dissolved. I was a boy again, walking through a sunlit laboratory, my mother's hand in mine. I remembered the clean, antiseptic smell of the place and the kindness in the eyes of Dr. Albright, the man my mother had mentored, the man who founded Northgate on a shoestring budget and a mountain of her encouragement. It was her passion project, the one pure thing she had managed to build away from the corrosive influence of my father's empire. After she died, I'd continued to donate, my anonymous contributions a quiet 30-year vigil. Their research into cellular regeneration is undervalued by the market, Marcus was saying, his words reaching me from a great distance. We'll absorb the patents, dissolve the foundation, and sell off the real estate. A clean, profitable decapitation, he smiled. It was the same smile he'd worn at my mother's funeral. I looked at him, truly looked at him, across the vast expanse of polished mahogany. He was a vandal, standing ready with a hammer to smash the last beautiful thing my mother had ever touched. The passive resentment I'd nurtured for a lifetime, a quiet and useless thing, suddenly cooled. It hardened. It sharpened into a blade. My hand resting on the table closed into a fist. He was going to gut her legacy for profit. Over my dead body. No, over his. I felt the smooth, cold lacquer of the tabletop under my knuckles. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about surviving my father. I was thinking about how to bury him. That evening, the silence of my penthouse was heavier than usual. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed quiet, the kind only $1 billion of construction can buy. 40 floors above the perpetual roar of New York, the city was a silent, glittering tapestry laid out at my feet. For most of my life, I had found a strange comfort in this isolation. Now, it felt like a tomb. I walked past the collection of abstract sculptures my father had bought for me, cold, geometric shapes of steel and stone, and into my library. This was the one room in the apartment that was truly mine. It smelled of aging paper and worn leather, a scent of the past that Marcus, with his obsession for the new and the next, despised. He hadn't set foot in here in 20 years. I poured myself 2 fingers of scotch, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. The cold, heavy feel of the crystal tumbler in my hand did little to steady me. My mind kept replaying the meeting, the casual flick of my father's wrist, the announcement of Northgate's impending doom. He was a force of nature, an earthquake in a suit. How could one man stand against him? The answer was simple. One man couldn't. Direct opposition was suicide. Legal challenges would be buried in motions by his army of lawyers. Appealing to the board was pointless. They were sycophants who owed their fortunes to him. To fight Marcus, I couldn't use his weapons. Money, power, influence. He held an unassailable position on that battlefield. I needed a different battlefield entirely. I needed a ghost. Someone who didn't exist in his world of balance sheets and stock tickers. Someone who could move through the cracks he couldn't see. And then, a memory surfaced. A face. Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, his third wife. She was 58 now, if my math was right. I remembered her not as the socialite Marcus had tried to mold her into, but as the woman she was before him, a sharp, witty art curator with eyes that missed nothing. I remembered sitting with her on a terrace in the Hamptons one summer afternoon. While everyone else was fawning over Marcus, she'd leaned over to me and quietly deconstructed the character of every person in his circle with terrifying accuracy. She saw the gears turning behind their eyes. I also remembered the day he'd cast her aside. There was no polite divorce, no quiet settlement. He had simply erased her. One day she was there, the next she was gone. Her assets were frozen in a legal blitzkrieg, her reputation shredded by rumors he'd planted himself. He'd made an example of her, a warning to anyone who might disappoint him. He had left her with nothing, which meant she had nothing to lose. A lifetime of my father's cruelty had taught me one thing. The people he broke were the only ones who could truly hurt him. I set my drink down and walked to the oldest desk in the room, a heavy oak piece that had belonged to my mother. From a locked drawer, I retrieved an old, leather-bound address book, its pages brittle with age. I ran my finger down the alphabetized tabs, the worn leather cool and dry against my skin. There, under K, was the name I was looking for. Franklin Cole was a private investigator, a man who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. I had used him once, 15 years ago, for a delicate matter concerning a friend. He was expensive, discreet, and existed entirely outside the digital world. His phone number was for a secure, untraceable line. I took out a small, prepaid burner phone I kept for emergencies, the cheap plastic a stark contrast to the opulence around me. The sound of the keypad beeping echoed in the silent room. He answered on the second ring. "No greeting, it's Arthur Sterling," I said. A pause. "It's been a while, Mr. Sterling." His voice was gravelly, impassive. "I need you to find someone for me." "Her name is Eleanor Vance, formerly Eleanor Sterling." "I know the name," he said. The unspoken words hung in the air. "So does everyone else. I need a current location. What she does, who she talks to, everything, and Franklin. This cannot be traced back to me in any way. The old protocols. The old protocols are more expensive now. That isn't a concern." I looked out the window at the river of headlights flowing down Fifth Avenue. "I need it yesterday." "You'll have it tomorrow," he said, and the line went dead. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I went through the motions, attending a charity luncheon, fielding calls from my wealth manager. But my mind was elsewhere. I was standing on a precipice, staring into an abyss of my own making. The following evening, a notification pinged on the burner phone. A single encrypted email. The subject line was blank. The body of the message contained only a secure link and a password. I typed the credentials into a laptop I'd purchased with cash that afternoon. A single file downloaded to the desktop. A plain, text-only document. Franklin Cole's report. My hand hovered over the mouse. This was it, the point of no return. Up until now, this had all been an idea, a fantasy of rebellion nurtured in the silence of my cage. But opening that file would make it real. It would be the first true decision I had made in my entire 72 years. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The cursor blinked, patient and impartial. He had found her. All I had to do was click the file and step off the edge of the world. The address in Cole's report led me to a place that felt like another country. A squat brick building in the Bronx, wedged between a discount tire shop and a shuttered laundromat. The words, "St. Jude's Haven for Women," were painted in faded blue letters over a steel door. My driver, a man I'd used for 20 years, idled the town car at the curb, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror with a look of silent, professional confusion. I was a long way from home. The air inside the shelter was thick with the smells of industrial bleach and boiled vegetables. It was a clean smell, but a tired one. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, clinical glow on the scuffed linoleum floors. A woman behind a pane of thick plexiglass looked up from her magazine, her expression weary. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Eleanor Vance," I said. The name felt strange on my lips, a relic from another life. Her eyes narrowed, giving my tailored suit a slow, dismissive appraisal. "Are you family?" "Yes," I lied. "I'm her stepson." She seemed unconvinced, but buzzed a lock on an inner door. "Common room. End of the hall." I found her sitting at a small formica table, reading a tattered paperback. She was 58, but the years since I'd last seen her had been unkind. She was thinner, her face etched with lines of hardship, her once lustrous auburn hair now streaked with gray and pulled back in a severe bun. But her clothes, though worn, were immaculate, and her eyes, when she looked up at me, were the same, sharp, intelligent, and utterly guarded. Recognition dawned, followed immediately by a glacial wall of suspicion. "Arthur," she said. Her voice was lower than I remembered, raspy. "To what do I owe the honor? Has your father finally sent one of his lapdogs to see if I've had the good grace to die yet?" The other women in the room glanced over, their curiosity piqued. This was the wrong place for this conversation. "Eleanor, can we talk? Somewhere private?" She let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Look around, Arthur. Privacy is a luxury I no longer have. Say what you came to say." Her gaze was a physical force, pinning me in place. Pity was the wrong move. So was charity. I had to speak her language. The language of strategy. The language of hate. "It's about Marcus," I said, lowering my voice. "It's about hurting him." That got her attention. A flicker of something, Interest, disbelief crossed her face. She studied me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine for deceit. Then she closed her book, the soft thump of it hitting the table a punctuation mark. "Not here," she said, standing. "There's a branch of the public library 6 blocks away. You can buy me a coffee from the cart on the corner on your way." She led the way, navigating the cracked sidewalks with a survivor's purpose. I felt clumsy and conspicuous in her wake. The coffee I bought her was black. She held the rough paper cup in her hands as if to warm them, though the October air was mild. The library was an oasis of quiet. It smelled of dust and old knowledge, a comforting, anonymous scent. We found a small, secluded table in the biography section, surrounded by the lives of great and powerful men. The irony was not lost on me. "All right, Arthur," she said, her voice low and intense. "You have my attention." "What is this?" I slid the burner phone I'd purchased across the table. Beside it, I placed a plain white debit card. Her eyes flicked down to the items, then back up to my face. "She didn't touch them. This isn't a handout, Eleanor. It's an investment. I'm not offering you a lifeline. I'm offering you a weapon." I leaned forward, my voice barely a whisper. "Marcus is planning to destroy something my mother built. I'm going to stop him, but I can't do it from the inside. He watches my every move. He has for 50 years. He sees me as a piece of furniture." "And what does he see me as?" she asked, her tone laced with acid. "Less than that," I answered honestly. "He sees you as dead and buried. You are a ghost, Eleanor. You don't exist in his world. That makes you the most dangerous person on earth to him." I laid out the plan. My access, her anonymity. I would be the source, the leak inside the corporate fortress. She would be the delivery system, an untraceable operative in the outside world, directing the information where it would do the most damage. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. The only sound was the distant hum of the library and the quiet rustle of a student turning a page nearby. When I finished, she stared at the burner phone sitting between us. It was a cheap, plastic thing, but in that moment, it held the weight of an empire. I had expected questions, negotiations, more suspicion. Instead, she asked only one thing. "Why now, Arthur? After all this time? Why get in the ring?" "Because he's about to burn down the last piece of my mother I have left," I said, the truth of it raw in my throat. "And I finally realized I have nothing else to live for. Or to lose." Her gaze softened for just a fraction of a second. She understood. She knew what it was like to have everything taken by him. She looked from my eyes to the phone. She picked it up. The plastic was smooth in her palm. Her knuckles were white. She turned it over, examining it as if it were a strange artifact. I held my breath. The entire future of my plan, of my life, rested on this single, silent moment. The weight of her decision felt immense, a tangible pressure in the quiet, dusty air. Finally, her fingers closed around the phone, a gesture of finality. She slid it into the pocket of her worn coat. She looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a victim. I saw a queen surveying a new kingdom, a general planning a war. "When?" she asked, her voice cold and clear as ice. "Do we start?" The first message arrived 3 days later, a single cryptic text on the burner phone, Grand Central. "North Concourse, 4 p.m., your turn." I felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline that was equal parts fear and exhilaration. The game had begun. For our first move, the target had to be small enough to go unnoticed, a pinprick, not a stab wound. I found it in the logistics division, a pending contract to secure exclusive shipping rights through a newly expanded Panamanian port. It was a lucrative deal, but not a transformative one. Its collapse would annoy my father, but it wouldn't raise alarms. The key was a single clause in the competing bidder's proposal, a detail I knew they'd undervalued. Getting the file was surprisingly easy. No one questioned me when I requested the preliminary contract briefs from the archives. I was Arthur Sterling, the harmless relic. The archivist, a young man with a perpetually nervous expression, practically tripped over himself to help. The air in the archive room was cold and dry, smelling of old paper and the faint metallic scent of the rolling metal shelves. I ran my hand over the rough cardboard of the file folder, the texture grounding me in the reality of what I was about to do. I used my personal office scanner, a device my father derided as obsolete, to digitize the relevant pages onto a small, unmarked USB drive. Grand Central at 4 p.m. was a symphony of controlled chaos. The sound was immense. 1,000 conversations, the rumble of trains below, the echoing announcements of arrivals and departures, all blending into a single, majestic roar. I felt anonymous here, just another man in a gray overcoat. Following Eleanor's texted instructions, I found a specific trash receptacle near the north side ticket windows. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd rehearsed the motion a dozen times in my mind, but my hand still felt clumsy and foreign. I crumpled a newspaper in my left hand, the cheap newsprint rough against my skin, and as I tossed it into the bin, I let the tiny USB drive fall from my right. It made no sound. It was a silent, invisible act of treason. I didn't wait around. I walked away, melting back into the river of commuters. The sense of being watched a paranoid prickle on the back of my neck. 2 days later, at the daily executive briefing, the head of logistics cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, there's been a small development with the Panama contract. It seems our competitor, Evergreen Maritime, submitted a revised bid at the 11th hour. They matched our offer and poached the Port Authority's chief negotiator. The deal is off." Marcus didn't even look up from his tablet. "Find out who was responsible for letting that negotiator get poached and fire them. Next." I kept my face a perfect mask of disinterest, my hands resting calmly on the mahogany table. But underneath, a fierce, triumphant heat spread through my chest. It worked. We had drawn first blood, and no one was the wiser. That night, a new text came. "Bigger bait catches bigger fish." She was right. It was time to escalate. The next target was far more dangerous, the R&D division. Specifically, Project Chimera, a new battery technology that was 6 months from being patented. A leak would be devastating, not just financially, but to the company's reputation. I spent a week meticulously planning my approach. Accessing the R&D servers required a higher level of clearance, one I didn't have, but I knew the system's weaknesses. The head of the department, a brilliant but arrogant man named Dr. Alistair Finch, was a creature of habit. Every day at 2:45 p.m., he went to the executive dining room for a cup of tea. He left his workstation logged in, a violation of protocol I had observed years ago. The R&D lab smelled of sterilized air and hot metal, a clean, sterile scent that always made my teeth ache. I waited until I saw Finch leave, then slipped inside his office. The low hum of the servers was a constant, almost subsonic pressure in the room. I had exactly 3 minutes. My fingers, slick with sweat, felt thick and clumsy on the keyboard. I inserted a new USB drive, the plastic clicking softly into the port. A small window popped up on the screen. Copying files. The progress bar crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness. 1 minute, 2. I could hear the ding of the elevator down the hall. My blood ran cold. I yanked the drive free just as the copy completed, my breath held tight in my chest. I was out of the office and around the corner seconds before Finch returned. The dead drop was the same, but the feeling was different. This wasn't a pinprick. This was a stick of dynamite. A week passed in agonizing silence. Then one morning, the name of a prominent tech journalist, someone known for her ruthless investigations, appeared in my news feed. The headline was explosive. Sterling Industries' Miracle Battery Tech appears on dark web. Stock tumbles. The fallout was immediate. The stock dropped 7% in an hour. An emergency board meeting was called. This time my father wasn't calm. His face was a thundercloud, his rage a palpable force in the boardroom. "This wasn't a hack," he snarled, his voice cutting through the terrified silence. The breach was too clean, too precise. It came from the inside. This was a betrayal. His eyes swept across the faces around the table, a predator searching for the weakest in the herd. For a terrifying second, his gaze landed on me. I met it without flinching, my lifetime of practice in hiding my thoughts serving as the ultimate armor. He looked away, dismissing me as he always did. "I'm bringing in Michael Thorne," he announced. The name sent a chill through the room. Thorne was his head of security, a man with a background in corporate espionage and a reputation for surgical cruelty. He was my father's phantom limb, the instrument he used for his dirtiest work. "He will find this rat. He will lock down every email, every keycard swipe, every phone call. No one is above suspicion." I sat there, motionless, the smooth, cool wood of the table beneath my hands. The game had changed. We had woken the dragon. This was no longer a strategic exercise. It was a hunt, and I was the prey. Michael Thorne descended upon Sterling Industries like a plague. Overnight, the building transformed. New security cameras, sleek black domes with unblinking lenses, appeared in hallways. Keycard access points were installed on previously open doors. An almost imperceptible, high-frequency hum filled the air, the sound of new listening devices and network sniffers. The atmosphere grew thick with paranoia. Colleagues who had worked together for decades now regarded each other with suspicion. The smell of fear was even stronger than the lemon polish in the boardroom. Our old methods were now impossible. The burner phone was too risky. Digital dead drops were out of the question. I found a new message from Eleanor etched in the dust on a subway station sign she had told me to watch. Bryant Park. Chess tables, Tuesday, 3 p.m. I found her there, hunched over a chessboard, playing against a grizzled old man who looked like he lived in the park. She didn't look at me as I sat at a nearby table, pretending to read a newspaper. Her moves on the board were our new language. A knight to b3 meant the file room was clear. A pawn to e5 meant to use a secondary location. It was her system, analog, brilliant, untraceable. Watching her, I felt a swell of profound respect. She wasn't just my ally. She was my general. I was no longer just seeking revenge. I was a soldier in her war. Her final move, a checkmate, was the signal. I left the park and went to the prearranged spot, a specific, hollowed-out book in the history section of the 42nd Street Library. The feel of the book's spine was cool and solid in my hand. Inside, I left a tiny roll of microfilm containing my next request. I need the weapon for Northgate. The response, left a day later, was a single, stark question on another roll of film. What does he fear more than losing money? The answer was simple: public humiliation tied to his past. The key to stopping the Northgate takeover wasn't in the future, but in the past. Specifically, in the sealed records of the company's first major acquisition, a steel mill buyout from 1968. I knew from my mother that the deal had been crooked, a hostile takeover that had destroyed a small Pennsylvania town. Marcus had buried the evidence, but physical records still existed in the sub-level deep storage archives. A place no one had physically entered in a decade. A place Thorne's digital dragnet wouldn't reach. Getting there was the problem. The archives were now behind a newly installed electronic lock. Thorne's system logged every entry. But Thorne, like my father, made the mistake of seeing only the present. He didn't account for the building's history, or for a forgettable old man. One afternoon, I accidentally shuffled into a utility closet on the sub-level, feigning a brief dizzy spell. The security guard who helped me was young, concerned. I apologized profusely, playing the part of the frail, elderly board member. While he was distracted, my hand slipped behind an old fuse box on the wall. My fingers found what I was looking for, a cold brass key. It was a manual override for the archive's original lock, a relic from before the digital age. A key I had seen the building's first superintendent use 50 years ago, and whose existence I was sure everyone, including my father, had forgotten. That night I returned. The silence of the basement was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the building's mechanical heart. The air was cold and damp, smelling of concrete and dust. The new electronic lock glowed red. Beside it, almost hidden by shadow, was the old keyhole. The brass key felt heavy, real, A key from a world before surveillance. It slid into the lock with a satisfying thunk. The sound of the tumblers turning was deafening in the silence. Inside, I found it. A single ledger, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages were filled with my father's familiar, arrogant handwriting, detailing a slush fund, payoffs to union leaders, and a fraudulent environmental report. It was the accounting irregularity that would make the Northgate deal radioactive. I photographed every page with a microfilm camera the size of my thumb. The drop was made. The wait began. A week later, we were in a board meeting when my father's personal counsel scurried into the room, his face pale. He whispered frantically in Marcus's ear. I watched as the color drained from my father's face, replaced by a mask of pure, cold fury. He stood up, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. The Northgate acquisition is on indefinite hold, he said, his voice a low, strangled growl. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't need to. He stared out the window, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. He had been beaten, and he had no idea who had thrown the punch. I felt a dizzying sense of triumph. My mother's legacy was safe. We had done it. The victory, however, was short-lived. Marcus was no longer just angry. He was obsessed. The leaks were too personal, too precise. He had been publicly humiliated. He tore into Thorne in a meeting so brutal I could hear the shouting through the closed office door. The next day, the real hunt began. Thorne's focus shifted from a broad company-wide sweep to a targeted investigation of the executive board and the Sterling family itself. My office was subtly searched. My personal driver was reassigned and replaced with a new one, a man with cold eyes who never spoke. My every movement was being logged, analyzed, scrutinized. The game of chess in the park was over. We had won the battle for Northgate, but in doing so, we had awakened the full, terrifying wrath of the king. That evening, as I unlocked the door to my penthouse, a small, almost invisible scratch on the brass lock plate caught my eye. It was fresh. It wasn't from my key. Someone had been here. Thorne. My blood ran cold. He was no longer just watching the board. He was watching me. The scratch on my door was a declaration of war. Thorne hadn't found anything. I was too careful for that, but he had breached my sanctuary. From that moment on, the golden cage became a true prison. I started seeing Thorne's men everywhere. A man reading a paper across the street from my building. A new doorman with the hard eyes of a former cop. A technician lingering too long near a junction box in my hallway. The low hum of surveillance was no longer just in the office. It followed me home. The first casualty was a man named George Riley. He had been my executive assistant for 30 years, a quiet, gentle man nearing retirement. He was loyal to a fault, not because he was involved in my plans, but because he had been a friend to my mother. Thorne's team, in their sweep of my life, must have seen this connection as a potential weakness. One Monday, I arrived at the office to find his desk cleared out, a generic potted plant in its place. The official story was that he'd taken an early retirement package. When I tried his home number, the line was disconnected. Thorne hadn't just fired him. He had erased him. The message was clear. Anyone close to me was a target. A week later, Eleanor sent a signal of her own. It was a chalk mark, a simple X, on a mailbox near one of our dead-drop locations. It meant danger, stay away. That night, watching the local news, I saw a report about a police sweep of homeless encampments near the Port Authority bus terminal, a place she sometimes used for its public computer terminals. The reporter mentioned several arrests for vagrancy. My blood turned to ice. For 2 days I heard nothing. I was suspended in a state of pure dread, the silence from her more terrifying than any threat from Thorne. Then, a new message appeared, etched on the same subway sign as before. New nets require new fish. She was safe, but she had been close to being caught. We were both being cornered, our worlds shrinking with each passing day. The only thing keeping me safe was my father's monumental arrogance. I saw it during a brief impromptu meeting in his office. Thorne was there presenting a report. As I entered, Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "Don't worry, Michael. My son's greatest conspiracy is deciding which shade of beige to wear. He's not our man." The insult, which would have once stung me, was now my only shield. My uselessness was my camouflage, but camouflage wasn't enough. I was running out of time. Thorn was a bulldog, and even if his master pointed him in the wrong direction, he would eventually circle back to me. I needed the final piece of the puzzle, the corporate kill shot, the proof of the fraud from the 1968 steel mill acquisition. The microfilm photos were good, but I needed the original ledger. A physical object was undeniable. It was the one thing that could burn Marcus's empire to the ground. And that's when I made my mistake. In my haste, driven by a new sense of urgency, I tried to access the deep storage archive manifest from my office computer. I needed to confirm the ledger's catalog number before attempting to retrieve it. It was a low-level administrative file, something that should have been harmless. But as the access request went through, a warning flashed on my screen. "This file is monitored." Access logged. A cold sweat broke out across my back. It was a digital tripwire. A trap laid by Thorn. I immediately closed the program, my heart pounding in my ears. I had been too comfortable, too sure of my invisibility. I had walked right into his snare. The confirmation came 12 hours later. An encrypted message on my burner phone from a source I had cultivated years ago. A young IT technician whose sister's medical school tuition I had quietly paid. The message was 6 words. "They have the server logs. They know, they had me." They knew I had accessed a monitored file related to the archives. It was the thread Thorn would pull until my entire life unraveled. I had at most a day before he connected the dots and brought his findings to my father. There was only one move left. Not a strategic retreat, but an all-or-nothing suicidal charge. I went back to the sub-level that night, the cold brass key feeling like a fool's talisman in my hand. Every sound, every drip of water, every distant rumble of the building felt like a footstep behind me. The air was thick with the smell of decay and my own fear. I retrieved the old leather ledger. It felt heavy in my hands, a heavy, dense block of my father's sins. I packaged it in a simple brown paper-wrapped parcel. Inside, with the ledger, I placed the last unmarked USB drive I owned. On it was everything, the R&D data, the Panama contract, the Northgate files, and a detailed summary of how he could be dismantled, piece by piece. My last dead drop took place in the cavernous, echoing halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I slipped the package into a locker in the coat check area, the cold metal key, a final tangible piece of my rebellion. I taped the key beneath a bench in the Greek and Roman exhibit, right where Eleanor's instructions had told me to. From a payphone on the corner of 82nd Street, I sent her my last text. "Locker 347, this is everything. Burn him to the ground. Disappear." I dropped the phone into a storm drain, the clatter of the cheap plastic swallowed by the city's roar. Then I turned and walked back to my penthouse. There was nothing left to do. I had fired the last shot. Now I just had to wait for the executioner. I waited. For 24 hours, the world outside my penthouse ceased to exist. I didn't answer the phone. I didn't turn on the television. I simply sat in the library, the scent of old leather and my mother's lingering memory a strange comfort. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the rooms where I had spent a lifetime of quiet desperation. The city lights began to glitter as dusk fell, each one a tiny, distant star in a universe from which I was now completely disconnected. I felt a profound sense of calm. I had fired the last bullet. There was nothing left to do but face the man who had made me. The knock on the door came just after 9 o'clock. It wasn't the aggressive bang of law enforcement, but a quiet, firm rap. Professional. I knew it was Thorn. I opened the door. He stood there, flanked by 2 of his men, all of them in dark, immaculate suits. Thorn's expression was one of cold, professional triumph. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "your father would like to see you in the boardroom." It wasn't a request. The elevator ride down was silent. The faint scent of Thorn's expensive cologne was cloying, a sterile smell that tried to cover the scent of the predator underneath. We walked through the empty, cavernous halls of the executive floor. The thick carpets muffled our footsteps, the only sound the quiet hum of the building's climate control. This was my father's kingdom, a monument to his power, and I was being led to my execution at its very heart. When we entered the boardroom, he was waiting. Marcus sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a lone, dark figure against the glittering backdrop of the city. He looked impossibly old and frail, but his eyes were burning with a cold, white-hot rage. "Leave us," he commanded Thorn's men. Thorn remained, standing by the door like a well-dressed gargoyle. "Explain this to me, Arthur," my father began, his voice dangerously low. "Explain to me how my own son, my own blood, could be the rat in my house." Thorn stepped forward, placing a tablet on the table. "We have the server logs, Marcus," his terminal accessing the archive manifest. "We also recovered security footage." He tapped the screen. An image appeared, a grainy black-and-white video of me, a stooped elderly man, at the door of the sub-level archives. He used a manual key, an old exploit. Clever. My father stared at the image, then at me. It wasn't anger in his eyes yet. It was a deep, profound confusion, the look of a man whose entire understanding of the world has been shattered. He could not comprehend it. I was his failure, his disappointment. I was not capable of this. "You?" he whispered, the word full of a lifetime of disdain. "You did this?" Before I could answer, the room was pierced by a sharp electronic chime. One of the junior board members, who had been summoned to witness my humiliation, looked down at his tablet. His eyes went wide. "Sir," he stammered, looking up at my father. "There's an alert, a press release, from Mitsuyama Holdings. They've just announced a hostile takeover bid for Sterling Industries." A low murmur of shock filled the room. Marcus's head snapped toward the man. At the same moment, the large television on the wall, permanently tuned to a financial news network, flashed a red breaking news banner. The Sterling stock ticker appeared next to it, with a downward-pointing arrow so steep it looked like it was falling off a cliff. Then another chime, this time from the General Counsel's phone. He listened for a moment, his face turning the color of ash. "Marcus," he said, his voice trembling. That was an associate. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District has just unsealed a whistleblower complaint against the company. It's extensive. It alleges 6 decades of fraud, bribery. They're citing evidence from the 1968 steel mill acquisition. He took a shaky breath. "Federal agents are in the lobby. They have a warrant." The room erupted. Shouts, accusations, panicked questions. The carefully constructed world of Sterling Industries was imploding in real time. My father stood frozen, his empire collapsing around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. His creation, his life's work, was being dismantled in a matter of seconds. And then, through the chaos, he looked at me. He saw me standing there, calm and still amidst the wreckage. He saw the security guards on either side of me. He saw the quiet satisfaction on my face. And in that one shattering moment, he finally understood. It wasn't a rival. It wasn't a disgruntled executive. It was me, his quiet, useless, elderly son. The ghost in his own house. The rage that filled his face was terrifying, a primal, apoplectic fury. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hand, the one with the heavy signet ring, rose as if to strike me, then it faltered. He clutched his chest, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. His eyes, fixed on mine, were wide with disbelief and the ultimate, impotent rage. Then the Titan fell. He collapsed sideways, scattering papers as he crashed to the floor, the heavy thud of his body swallowed by the noise of his dying empire. Silence. The shouting stopped. The panic froze. Everyone stared at the fallen giant on the floor. Michael Thorne rushed to his side, but it was too late. The monster was gone, and I, His son was the only thing left standing. The storm broke, and in its wake came a strange and deafening quiet. I was not arrested. In the eyes of the federal government, I was a key witness, the architect of my father's downfall and the sole possessor of the roadmap to his crimes. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions and legal meetings. My father's lawyers fought, but Eleanor's dossier was a masterpiece of destruction. The old ledger, the physical proof of his original sin, was the cornerstone of a case so massive it sent shockwaves through the entire financial world. Sterling Industries, the empire that had cast a shadow over my entire life, was carved up and sold for parts like a fallen beast. I never heard from Eleanor again. Our pact was one of silence and distance, but 2 months into the legal proceedings, the Northgate Medical Foundation received a substantial anonymous donation. It was wired from a numbered account in Florence, a city I knew she had always dreamed of seeing. It was her final message, a quiet confirmation. The ghost had found her peace. By the spring, the dust had settled. My father had been moved from the hospital to a private long-term care facility upstate. He was alive, but the massive stroke had left him paralyzed and unable to speak, a prisoner in the ruins of his own body. My lawyers advised me against going, but I had to see him one last time. The facility smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. It was a place of hushed voices and the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes. I found him in a sunlit room overlooking a meticulously manicured garden. He was propped up in a hospital bed, a thin blanket pulled up to his chest. The titan of industry, the man whose voice could make markets tremble, was now a shrunken figure, his face slack, his eyes vacant. The only sound was the rhythmic, gentle beep of a heart monitor. I stood by his bed for a long time, looking down at him. The rage I had carried for 72 years was gone. The fear was gone. In their place was only a profound and weary quiet. He had been the sun I had orbited my entire life, a star of such terrible gravity that it had warped everything around it. Now he was just a dying ember. His eyes, for a brief moment, flickered toward me. There was a glimmer of something in their depths, a spark of the old fire, a flash of recognition, of pure, impotent hatred. Then it was gone, leaving only the vast emptiness behind. I felt the cool metal of the bed rail under my hand. I had won. I had dismantled his empire and his legacy. But there was no triumph in it. There was only closure. "Goodbye, Father," I said to the silent room. I turned and walked away, and did not look back. The man who walked out of that facility was not Arthur Sterling, son of the billionaire. That man had died in the boardroom with his father. The man who walked into the crisp spring air was just Arthur. 6 months later, I found myself sitting at another table. This one was not made of mahogany. It was a cheap laminate folding table, covered in blueprints and coffee stains. I was in a small, cramped office at the Northgate Medical Foundation. The room smelled of fresh paint and brewing coffee. Through the window, I could hear the sound of construction, the clang of steel, and the shouts of workers. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. After the government took its share and the lawsuits were settled, there wasn't much left of the Sterling fortune. But there was enough. A young woman, Dr. Eris, the head of the Foundation's research department, slid a cup of coffee toward me. Her face was bright with an excitement I had never seen in my father's boardroom. "The preliminary reports from the genetics lab are promising." "Arthur," she said, tapping a finger on a complex-looking chart, "with the new wing you funded, we can accelerate the trials. This could change everything for patients with degenerative nerve disorders." I looked from her hopeful face to the blueprints spread across the table. They showed the plans for the Caroline Sterling Memorial Wing, a new state-of-the-art research facility. I was using the last of my father's money to build my mother's dream. The corrupt legacy of the steel mill buyout was being transmuted, dollar by dollar, into a legacy of healing. I ran my hand over the rough paper of the blueprint, the texture real and full of promise under my fingertips. I was no longer an ornament. I was a builder, Here, in this small, quiet room, surrounded by people who were creating instead of conquering, I felt the weight of my 72 years lift. My father had built an empire to cast a shadow. I was building something to create light. For the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely at peace.